Welcome guys, and today we'll be having a quick presentation on AngularJS framework, which is the most famous JavaScript based framework for UI development these days. So Angular was launched by Angular back in 2010, and since then it has been the first choice for most of the developer for quick web development. So we'll be having a look on the basic framework that Angular provides, the basic functionalities that Angular provides, which makes the work in Angular easy. So to start with Angular, all you need is a good understanding of HTML and JavaScript, a basic understanding of how web application work. Then you will be needing a text editor of your own choice, whatever it is. You might want to use Sublime Text or even Notepad++ will do. Then we'll be using Angular libraries, and additionally Angular needs another library, that is jQuery. And then finally we need a web browser to process our code and to see how well we have done. So to start with the features of Angular, the first good thing that Angular provides is a separation of your view layer from your JavaScript code. Then there is a concept of two-way binding in Angular that we will see in detail later. Then there is something called dependency injection in Angular, which provides you with a ready-made amount of code to work with, so that you don't have to call every object each time, then instantiate an object, then make a class out of it, make an object out of it, then use it in your application. So all this is readily done by Angular framework for you, and you just have to inject a dependency and use it the way you want. Then Angular provides directive to extend the HTML behavior, all that we are going to see in detail. Okay, so to describe the Angular application or the Angular architecture, we can see here the topmost point in any Angular application is a module. So a module is then divided into separate components. A few of them are controller, directives, filters, and you can see on the screen all of them. So basically an entire Angular application is made out of all these components clubbed together. So how do we declare an Angular application? The first thing that you will be doing whenever you start with an Angular application is you will be declaring a module. So how we declare a module? Angular provides us with a keyword, that is Angular. So you declare a module on top of this Angular keyword. It's a global variable, so you will be using this global variable to declare your module. The syntax for declaring the module you can see on the screen: angular.module, then it is followed by the name of the module, which is app name here, and then it takes an array of dependencies. I will skip that dependencies for later. Basically these are nothing but an external set of module to be included in your module, which will serve as dependency to your module. So once you have added or you have declared an dependency here, then that particular module also works as if it is a part of your own module. So Angular has this capability of clubbing various modules into one module. So once the module declaration is done, then we can go on with declaring other components on top of this module. Right. So one thing to be kept in mind here is basically your application should have one root module at a time. Basically you should be doing this angular.module thing only once in your application, right? You should not be doing this more than once, because by default the Angular bootstraps, or to say it, the Angular starts or Angular launches only one of your module. If in case you have multiple module architecture, then the other module you need to declare and bootstrap by yourself using the bootstrap command at the bottom of the screen. But be aware of it, Angular team itself suggests to work with only one module at a time, not more than one. So we'll be restricting ourselves to just one module in this presentation. So once this app declaration is done, the module declaration is done, the next thing that you want to do is you want to club this module name with your HTML part. So basically your HTML is in sync with your JavaScript code all the time using this particular module name. As you can see at the bottom part, we have used a directive, that is ng-app. We will quickly see what directive is, but for now you can just take them as a attribute on HTML tag, which takes the app name and then clubs your entire HTML with this app name module in Angular. Basically, we need not to do this at HTML node, and we can do it any node of our choice, but the thing is that whichever node you attach this ng-app directive, your Angular application works only till that node. So for example, if you attach this ng-app directive to let's say a div node, then the entire application will be restricted till the div node only. So since we are considering a full-fledged single page application, so we would like to attach this ng-app directive at the root node of our application, that is HTML tag. Hope that's clear. Moving ahead, so once after declaring the Angular application, what's the next step? The first thing that we'll discuss here is controller. Controller are the main workhorses in Angular. So basically, the screen rendering or the screen controlling or the display of data, all of these things are done basically in a controller. To understand the controller, you should think is of something which literally controls a part of your screen, a display on your screen. So if you are seeing something on your screen, all the bindings, all the variables that are declared in that screen, or all the text, all the data that is being populated on that screen, to say it is being controlled by a file which is known as controller in application. So the component of Angular that does the data binding or the data retrieving from the screen part, from the UI, from the user interaction, it is known as controller. So a controller is defined on the top of the original Angular app or the module, and the syntax to do it you can see on the screen. First of all, you need to retrieve that module name using angular.module and the app name. No need to have that dependencies here, just the app name, angular.module, the app name, and then .controller. .controller is the function that you need to call on this module to create a controller. So this .controller takes the name of your controller, and then it takes a controller function where you will be having the entire logic for your controller function. So the name of the controller can be anything of your choice. Here we have just given it name for the controller, right? So now this controller can be attached to your screens by using ng controller directive. You already saw the use of ng-app to attach the entire app to your HTML node. In the similar way, the ng controller is yet another directive that combines or that clubs the name of the controller to your part of the screen. So basically, wherever you club this controller, that part of the screen gets to be governed by this particular controller. The logic written inside this controller will govern only that part of the screen. So for example, in this case, only this div and anything that comes inside this div will be controlled by the controller function. Okay, so each controller by default gets a scope property. A scope property is nothing but an object. Any property declared on top of this object is readily available to the template governed by the controller. So in this case, any property declared on top of this scope object inside the controller function will be available to the div DOM and all the nodes or all the DOM inside this div DOM, right? Additionally, we have one rootscope property. Basically, this is the most important, or to say the most top layer scope of your application, which is present all throughout the application, and all the other scopes, that is all the other controller scopes, are derived from this root scope. So this root scope is the parent of all the scope in an application, right? Moving ahead, we'll see what the two-way binding is. By two-way binding, we mean that anything that is on screen is in direct touch with its model or its JavaScript part in the model layer. So for example, if you have a binding done on the screen. Any object or any data from any variable is banded to the screen. As and when you change the property on the model side or on the JavaScript side, the data should change on the screen also. Or anyhow, if you change the data on the screen, it should automatically get reflected to the model and the value should change on the fly. So you can see on the figure below, if the user interacts with the view layer, then the view layer via the Angular framework updates the model layer also. Or if there is any change in the model layer via Angular framework again change the view layer. So this is how the two-way binding works. Okay, so now we'll consider watching mechanism. Watching mechanism is something which is used extensively by Angular to produce this two-way binding. Basically, every scope property which is bound to the UI or which is bound to the view layer is being watched by the Angular framework. So whenever there is any change in the value of any such property, Angular internally calls a $apply method, which in turn call a $digest method or a $digest loop. So what happens in this loop is Angular basically watches all the bindings, all the UI bound properties, and then watches them recursively and then updates any change on them, and the screen gets stabilized only when there are no further changes to be made. So one thing to be noted down here is this recursiveness of Angular gets terminated after a particular amount of time if there are still changes to be made. So basically, suppose if a change was triggered and then Angular cycle was run, the loop was running, and while the loop was running again the value gets changed, which results in another loop running. And in this way, if this whole cycle goes on more than 10 times, Angular throws up his hand and says and gives exception basically. Okay, so what else to watching mechanism? Yeah, we can have a custom watch to be put on a certain object. For that we need to use scope.$watch property, and we need to provide the property name followed by the function to be called when that property gets changed. So in this example, if you see, we are watching a property name property on our scope. So whenever this property name property gets changed, this function to be called function will be called, right? And whatever logic is there written inside this function will run on every change of this property name value. One thing important to be noted down here is only when the value changes the function gets to be called. Suppose the initial value was 15 and you change it somehow to be 16, the function will be called. But if you somehow change 15 to 15, the function will not be called. So this is how Angular watches a property on any object. Next thing is event handling mechanism. So basically in a real world application, what happens is we end up with lot many controllers. We have data flowing from one part of the application to the other, which are being handled by various controllers. So how do we get to communicate between all these controllers? So there are few event handling mechanism provided by Angular. We'll quickly have a look on them. The first one of them is $emit, then we have a $broadcast, and then finally we have a $on property. So basically $emit and $broadcast are the event senders, you can say. Their job is to emit or broadcast the event, and $on's job is to listen to this event and perform any function. So $emit, if you emit any event using $emit, it will be emitted to all the scope at its own level, plus all the scopes that are on top of it. Okay, so all the scopes that are parent to it. Similarly, when a scope is broadcasted, it is provided to all the scopes at its own level, plus all the scopes which are down the line in the hierarchy to it, or let's say which are child component to it. So in any of these scopes, any of these controllers, you can have a $on listener, and you can listen to that particular event being propagated, being emitted, or being broadcasted, and then you can call your own function. As here we are calling function to call to react to that event, right? Next important thing we need to discuss is directive. So we have already seen the use of directive, ng app and ng controllers were the directive that we have already seen. So what basically is a directive? Directive in Angular is any component which enhances the property of HTML. So basically it's a DOM manipulator. It's a markup on DOM that provides extended capabilities to the regular HTML. So in simple word, if we see, directive is a component which is being designed to carry out a certain amount of logic attached to the HTML, and whenever the Angular framework compiles the HTML, it comes across directive, it gets to know what particular logic needs to be performed. So like controller, the way to declare a directive is using angular.module, the app name. It is the same app name that you declared once. Remember, there is going to be just one app name, and the same app name or the same module will be retrieved every time for creating new component and will not be created again. So here we are calling the same app name module, and then we are calling dot directive syntax on top of it, which takes a name for the directive and then a directive function. So once the directive is created, it can be used in multiple ways in your DOM. It can be used as an attribute property, as you can see in the first case, or it can be used as element property itself, as you can see in the second case. So while defining a directive, the directive function basically returns a directive definition object which contains the properties which tells Angular about what kind of directive it is. Okay, we'll quickly see what all properties are written by directive definition object. So the common properties that directive definition object returns is first as the restrict type, which can be one of E, A, C or M. So E here stands for element, A stands for attribute, C stands for class, and M stands for comments. So this tells Angular how to use the directive. So as you see as you saw in the previous slide, so that depending on E, A or C or M, the directive is being used as an attribute or as an element. Next to directive is the service. Service again are a component on top of Angular module, but service are somehow different from the directives. Service are the constructor function in Angular which provides an application-wide scope for your data. Basically, to say, Angular services are nothing but a single object which are created at the start of the initialization of service. Whenever a service is called, this particular instance is created, and from that point of time the same instance is carried forward in the entire application. Whenever that service is called, the same instance is being returned, and in this way we get the data which was stored at one particular point of time to another particular point of time. I will explain that to you quickly. Basically, you declare application like this, using again your module name with dot service function, taking a service name and then a service function. So as I said, service function is a constructor function, so you can define the property using this keyword, like this dot property is equal to some string or some name, some number, whatever you want. And similarly you can define this dot my function is equal to function. Okay, now here comes the concept of dependency injection for using your services. So if you remember the control from our controller slide, you can inject the service name into the controller function using this service name in the arguments of this controller function. So basically we are providing the same service name to the controller function, and then we are able to use that service name inside of our controller. So this way you can use the service for creating and storing any kind of data at any point of your application, and then you can retrieve the same data at any other point, because the application service because the service are singleton object, your data is going to be maintained. There is no other instance being created, so whatever you stored on one instance will be available to you at the same instance again. Okay, next thing that we are going to see is constant. Again, like services are a singleton object, the basic difference being the state of these objects are not going to be changed anywhere, or say they are mutable. So constants are being used basically for keeping the hardcode data of your application, like URLs or any configuration values, like the number of users or or that kind of stuff, right? Any kind of stuff which is going to be static throughout your application can be kept in constant file. So constant component, again similar to all other components, is being declared on top of your module using .constant property, which takes a constant name followed by a constant object. Please note, this time it's an object and not a function like in service or controller or directive. It's just a single object. Again, this object can be declared as a dependency into various other components, like we have declared this constant name as a dependency in our service function by including it in the service function constructor. Then this constant name can be used to retrieve any property from it inside this service. Last thing that we are going to see is few best practices that you need to follow while using Angular application. So the first thing is, you should devise your own controller based on the distinct property of your application. You should beforehand conclude which part of the application is going to be governed by a particular controller. Then you should use the controller for only the scope bindings of that particular part. Any data manipulation or any business logic manipulation should be passed to the services. All the DOM manipulations should be kept inside the directive. Limit the use of rootscope to a minimum. Use emit and broadcast instead for communication between multiple controllers. And keep all the application constant in a constant component, and use a dedicated service to handle any data exchange from external services, like calling any public APIs or calling any backend APIs or anything of that sort. So thank you. That was a quick explanation of various Angular components, what functionality does they provide, how to use them, how to create them, how to write them, and few best practices that you might need to follow while creating an Angular application. Thank you. For more details on all these components, you might want to check the URL mentioned on the screen. Thank you guys.